I don't know about you, but I'm always fed up with the trains and railways, etc. My poor producers are probably turning grey over the amount of times I'm late to the... Who wrote this? Who wrote this? OK, all right, no, yes, no. My train service is notoriously slow, yes.
Well, David, I wasn't involved. David shares some of these frustrations with you, Patrick. He thinks it's a shambles that the government have allowed railways to fall into such chaos in the 21st century. He's asked why they are in such a state and why our trains are so expensive. One of the reasons often given for the state of our railways is a decision of John Major's government to privatise them back in the 90s.
Yes, you can barely fit Jeremy Corbyn in the aisle these days, but there we go. Well, David, we've organised you a debate on the state of our railways and whether privatisation is actually to blame. And we're delighted to be joined by Christian Wilmer, a transport author and columnist, and by Professor Len Shackleton as well, editorial and research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs. Thank you very much both for joining us. Len, I'll throw over to you, please, first, my good man. Should we nationalise the railways?
Well, I don't think we should. The Shapps-Williams report, which has come out, is a real dog's dinner mixture of things. Is it nationalisation? Whatever. Very little mention of things like open access, of freight, anything like this. Focus on, I've just been reading what they said in the Queen's speech. It says, clear lines of accountability, joined-up leadership, customer-focused railway, no cliches omitted. So is this really nationalisation? I don't know, and I'd be very interested to hear what Christian has to say about this. He's got a new book out, I think, about the former British Rail, and let's hear what he has to say about it.
George here, one of our viewers or listeners, he says, I really miss the old British Rail with its lukewarm stewed tea and sandwiches curling at the edges. I think it's a bit tongue-in-cheek there. But let's go to you, Christian. Look, the rail fares are incredibly expensive. I think the average annual season ticket now is £4,000, and some of them go up to £6,000, £7,000. I mean, would nationalisation have an effect on that? What kind of effect do you think it would have? Because ultimately that's what people care about, isn't it? Cheaper rail fares.
Well, let's first of all debunk the thing about sandwiches. I wrote about this in my book, which is called British Rail, A New History, out next month with Penguin. And actually, the sandwiches were excellent. British Rail actually invented shrink-wrapped sandwiches. And had people like Prue Leaf on the board to improve catering. And actually, there's a serious point there that under nationalisation, there was a coherent structure. You knew what you were getting. It wasn't always perfect, but at least understood how it worked. You knew who to blame when things went wrong. And the way that they've privatised it means that it's fragmented. Nobody knows who's responsible for what. Are the fares the responsibility of the government, or are they the responsibility of the train operators? And the answer is, well, both. And so they're moving towards a new structure, but I'm worried that they're going to replicate all the mistakes that have been made under privatisation. When it comes down to it, the railways need national subsidy. No other railway in the world kind of is for itself. So you need subsidy. You're bound to have government involvement. But what you don't want is the government running the railways on a day-to-day basis. You want it to be run by expert managers with a budget that is absolutely clear, and they have to kind of fulfill, whatever criteria the government sets them. But the idea that I'm worried about is that we're going to get, yet more muddle and not a coherent structure.
Yeah, Len, let's just go to you. Obviously, you're at the Institute of Economic Affairs, and, I don't mean to brag, but I'm a 90s baby, so I don't quite recall sort of John Major's government in vivid detail and why the arguments that were flying around at the time when it came to privatisation. But what is the economic case for nationalisation at this point in time? Because, the government's running out of money for most things.
Well, I agree. I think there's as your viewers suggest, there's a lot of complaints about the railways. A lot of them are down to things like delays, confusions, which is really down to the already nationalised network rail rather than the train operating companies. The cost of railways, I mean, this is, essentially, although we're upgrading it, this is a 19th century technology. It's very expensive to maintain. It's very expensive to run railways. And the comparisons with other countries are fairly meaningless because we're talking about subsidies. Do we think that the general taxpayer ought to cough up and keep fares very low? Well, why do that? Because, 4 out of 10 people never set foot on a train from one year to the next. So why should the general taxpayer subsidise fares? Yeah, we can do it, I suppose, but there are many, many calls on government spending at the moment, post-COVID, and I don't think just shoveling more money into the railways is the way to do it.
OK, well, I'll lob it back over to the other side and just say, look, I suppose we keep hearing, don't we, about environmentalism and, that we need to get, to grips with this big green agenda, etc. Well, at the moment, if people don't want to take the trains or they can't take the trains or they can't rely on the trains, then they're more likely to keep driving, aren't they?
Yes, I mean, that's a typical Institute of Economic Affairs answer, and it's plainly wrong. The reason why that even the 4 out of 10 people who don't use the railways benefit from them is precisely what you suggest, that if there weren't the railways, there'll be massive traffic jams everywhere. There would be no longer the kind of benefits you get by enabling people to get into city centres cheaply and effectively. There would be much less contribution to the green agenda and so on. What the Institute of Economic Affairs never understands is a thing called externalities, which is, in other words, that even if you never use the railways, you benefit from them because of all the things that I've mentioned. And so that's why we need a railway. That's why it's very important that it is subsidised and supported in the same way that the education is, the army is, the police are, and so on. It's a social service that also happens to be a transport service.
Yeah, let's just let Professor Len Shackleton get back to that because he's put some criticism towards
He said you were completely wrong.
Well, I know Christian's views on the IEA from the past. There are externalities. No serious economist would deny that. I teach this stuff all the time. But what kind of value would you put on these externalities, Christian? And how big a subsidy do you think the taxpayer should make on this? The taxpayer coughed up an extra £14 billion during COVID on top of the already large subsidies given. Do you want to put a figure on it? Tell us by how much the taxpayer ought to cough up for this.
Okay, all right. Well, let's do that then, because we're a bit pressed for time. So, Christian, go on. You put a number on it.
Well, I think you pay enough to have a good railway service accessible to all and at a relatively reasonable price. Just in the same way that you subsidise the roads. Nobody's actually saying that we ought to close bits of the network because nobody uses it very much. The railways are heavily used. They'll be used more if the fares were kind of reasonable. And I hope your train comes on time.
Good stuff. All right, well, look, both of you, thank you very, very much, of course. That is Christian Woolmer, transport author and columnist, and Professor Len Shackleton, editorial and research fellow at the Institute of Economic Affairs.